handed me the folder across the breakfast table like she was passing me the morning paper. No explanation, no warning. Just slid over the coffee rings and the half-eaten toast and looked at me like she was waiting to see if I'd flinch. I didn't, but my hands weren't steady when I opened it. Inside was a letter from her attorney, dated 3 days prior. I'd been living in this house for 41 years, and somehow my wife had already spoken to a lawyer before she'd spoken to me. I set the folder down, picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. "We should talk," she said. I told her we probably should have talked 3 days ago. She didn't answer that. I should back up, because if I start there with the folder, with the cold coffee, it sounds like the story begins at the end, and it doesn't. It begins the way most things begin, slowly, and so quietly you don't notice until you're already deep inside it. My name is Bernard. I'm 64 years old. I spent 37 years as a structural engineer before I retired, and for most of those years I built things that were meant to hold weight. Bridges, parking structures, the kind of work where you don't get to be wrong, where being wrong means something falls down and people get hurt. I mention that because it matters later. My wife. I'll call her my wife even now because that's still what she is on paper. Her name is Sylvia. We met when we were both 22 at a 4th of July party at a mutual friend's lake house in Michigan. She was funny and sharp and had this way of looking at you like she was deciding something about you that you'd never get to hear. I fell in love with her in about 48 hours and spent the next 4 decades grateful for it. We had a daughter, Meredith. 38 now, lives in Denver with her husband and my 2 grandkids. Smart girl. Got her mother's stubbornness and, I'd like to think, something of my patience. We had a life. A real one, not a magazine version. Disagreements, dry spells, years that were tight and years that weren't. Nothing that ever made me think we were anything other than solid. That's the part that stays with me now. I thought we were solid. About 4 years ago, Meredith's husband, his name is Todd, he's a decent man, grew up in Colorado, works in commercial real estate, started his own firm. Small operation, just him and 2 partners initially. Meredith had always been the practical one in their marriage. She handled their finances, kept their household running, worked part-time as an accountant while the kids were young. When Todd's firm started gaining traction, Meredith stepped in to help full-time. It made sense. She had the skills. She knew the numbers. She'd always been the one who understood how money moved. What I didn't fully see at the time was that Sylvia was watching all this very closely. Sylvia had been a homemaker for most of our marriage. By her choice, I want to be clear about that, because she sometimes later implied otherwise. When Meredith was young, we had a conversation, and she told me she wanted to be home. I supported her in that, financially and otherwise, for 35 years. I never once made her feel small for it. At least I thought I hadn't. But watching Meredith build something with Todd, watching her daughter have a seat at a table with her name on it, I think something shifted in Sylvia that I didn't catch in time. About 3 years ago, she told me she wanted to get involved in Todd's firm. Not a clerical role. She meant real involvement. Strategic decisions. She'd been taking online courses, she said, reading everything she could find about real estate development. She thought she could contribute. I'll admit I was surprised, not dismissive, or so I told myself, but surprised. Sylvia was 60 at the time. The firm was young and fragile. I mentioned those things. I said maybe start smaller, maybe consult with Todd first, maybe this needed more time. She heard it differently than I meant it. I know that now. Todd, to his credit, did bring her on, officially as a strategic advisor. He gave her a title and a small equity stake and the kind of deference you give a family member when you're trying to be generous without being reckless. What happened over the next 2 years was something I did not anticipate. Sylvia was good at it. Better than good, actually. She had a natural instinct for client relationships, for reading people, for the soft skills that Todd and his partners sometimes lacked. She started bringing in referrals, long-term clients, people she'd known socially for decades, who trusted her in a way they didn't yet trust a company with a short track record. The firm grew faster than Todd had projected. He acknowledged that Sylvia was part of the reason. He gave her a larger equity position, more say in decisions. Her title changed twice in 18 months. And I watched all of this from her kitchen table, and I felt genuinely proud of her. What I didn't see, because I was watching the surface, was what was happening underneath. The dinners where I'd ask how a deal was going, and she'd give me one-sentence answers. The weekends where she'd drive into Denver for meetings and come back hours later and not tell me what had been discussed. The gradual shift in how she spoke to me, less like a partner and more like I was someone she needed to manage. Small things, the kind that don't feel significant when they're happening. I told myself she was busy. I told myself she was adjusting to something new and it would level out. About 14 months ago, Todd's firm was approached by a regional development group out of Phoenix. They were looking to acquire or merge with a smaller Colorado operation. The valuation being discussed was significant, enough to change a lot of people's situations permanently. I learned this not from Sylvia, but from Meredith. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in the garage working on a woodworking project. She said, "Dad, I assume you know what's happening with the firm." And I said I knew there'd been some interest from Phoenix. Sylvia had mentioned it in passing, and Meredith got quiet in a way that told me she'd assumed I knew more than I did. She said, "Mom has been one of the main voices pushing for the acquisition to go through." I said that sounded like it made sense if the terms were right. Meredith said, and she's been in conversations with them about her role post-acquisition. I said, "What do you mean her role?" She said, "They want her to stay on, Dad, in a senior leadership position. She'd be running the Colorado division." I stood in the garage holding a piece of sandpaper and said nothing for a few seconds. "Does she know you're telling me this?" I asked. There was a pause. "She asked me not to, but you're my father." That evening I waited for Sylvia to come home. She was later than she'd said she'd be. I had dinner ready, which I've been doing more often since she got busy. I'm a decent cook, always have been, and was never a source of tension. She came in and set her bag on the chair by the door the way she always does, and I asked her how her day went. She said, "Fine, busy, lots of moving parts right now." I said I'd heard. She turned and looked at me then, really looked at me, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen before. Not guilt exactly, more like calculation. She said, "Meredith told you?" I said yes. She sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't apologize for not telling me. She said she'd been waiting for the right time. She said there were sensitivities around the negotiation and she couldn't share details with everyone. I said, "I'm not everyone." She said she knew that, but that her role in this was professional and she needed to keep those boundaries. Those words, professional boundaries, between a husband and wife of 41 years. I said okay. I said I was glad she was having success. I meant it. I asked if we could talk more about what this would mean for her schedule, for us, once things settled. She said of course. She said she'd fill me in once the deal was finalized. I nodded. I went back to finishing dinner, and something in the kitchen felt different, though I couldn't have named it that night. The deal closed 11 months ago. Sylvia was given the title of Regional Director of Development. She had an office in downtown Denver, a team of 6, and a compensation package I didn't learn the details of until much later. She was good at the job. The results showed it. Within 2 quarters, the Colorado division was outperforming the Phoenix group's projections. I noticed that she stopped asking my opinion about anything related to work, which in itself was fine. She didn't need my approval. I'd never asked her to seek it. But she also stopped sharing. The conversation at dinner moved from, "Here's what happened today," to short summaries, then to silence, then to her being on her phone. We stopped taking our evening walks, the ones we'd been doing together for about 12 years, around the neighborhood after dinner. It was a small thing, but it was ours. She started traveling for work, 2, 3 nights at a stretch, a couple of times a month. I didn't question it. The job required it. I stayed home, took care of the house, worked on my projects in the garage, called Meredith, looked after things. I felt like a man waiting for his wife to come home, except she was already there when she was there. I tried to say that to her once. She said I was being dramatic. 8 months ago, Todd called me. Not Sylvia. Todd, my son-in-law, who I'd watched build something from nothing and who I genuinely liked. He asked if he could come by. Said he wanted to talk to me about something, man to man, if that was all right. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and he said, "Bernard, I want you to know I respect you, and that's why I'm having this conversation." He told me that over the past several months, Sylvia had been in discussions with the Phoenix Group about restructuring the terms of her equity in the original firm, that she'd had meetings with the company's legal team, not through the firm's attorney but through her own, retained privately, that there were conversations happening that Todd and his partners were not fully aware of until recently. He said, "She's not doing anything illegal, but she's playing a longer game than any of us knew." I asked him what that meant. He said the Phoenix Group had been so impressed by Sylvia's performance that they were considering a further restructuring, one that would effectively give her a majority stake in the Colorado operation, independent of Todd's original firm. She'd been quietly positioning herself for that. She'd been the one to suggest it to them months before anyone else knew it was on the table. He said, "Your wife is about to be a very powerful person, Bernard, and I think she's been preparing for something you don't know about yet." I sat with that for a long time after he left. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was angry at her success, but because I was starting to understand that what I'd thought was distance and stress and adjustment was something more deliberate than that. 6 months ago, I sat in the offices of a man named Carson, a private attorney in Boulder who a friend had recommended. I told him the full picture. Everything I had observed, what Todd had shared, the financial structure of our marriage, my retirement accounts, the house, we'd owned it outright for 8 years. I laid it out the way I used to lay out structural drawings. Every load-bearing point, every place where the weight would fall. Carson listened. He didn't say much during. When I finished, he looked at me across his desk and said, "How soon do you want to start?" I said I wasn't sure I wanted to start anything. I said I still hoped things might be different. I said I was 64 years old, and I'd been married for 41 years, and I did not take that lightly. He said he understood, but he said there were protective steps I could take that didn't require filing anything, didn't require confrontation, didn't require any decision at all right now, just preparation. I said, "What kind of preparation?" He told me about a structure, a qualified personal residence trust, and some options around retirement accounts. He told me to make sure I had a thorough accounting of every asset, every account, every piece of property that was mine by contribution or by statute. I'd spent 37 years building things designed to hold weight. I knew what it meant to check your load calculations before something broke, not after. I started working with Carson quietly. 3 months of documentation, of understanding exactly where everything stood, of knowing the numbers. I told no one. 3 weeks ago, Todd's firm held a formal dinner to celebrate the completion of the restructuring, a private room at a restaurant in Denver that Meredith told me cost more per plate than our first car payment. Sylvia told me about the event 2 days before. She said it would be mainly professional contacts, that it was a work function, that she hoped I'd come and be gracious. She said it like she was briefing a colleague. I said I'd be there. I wore the good suit, the charcoal one I'd bought for Meredith's wedding. It still fit. I sat beside Sylvia through dinner, watched her work the room between courses. She was impressive, genuinely. The way she knew everyone's name, the way she made each person feel attended to. I'd always known she had that gift. I just didn't know she had that gift. I just didn't know she'd been practicing it in my direction for decades. After dessert, the company's principal from Phoenix, a man named Harrison, tall, good handshake, the kind of man who fills a room without meaning to, stood and gave a short speech. He talked about growth, about finding the right leaders, about the Colorado operation exceeding expectations. And then he said that they'd be making a formal announcement the following week, but that tonight he wanted to recognize the person most responsible for those results. He said Sylvia's name. He said she would be assuming the role of president of the Colorado division, effective the 1st of the month. The room applauded. Sylvia stood. She looked composed, pleased, exactly what she'd intended to look. I applauded too, because I was proud of her, even then, even knowing what I was beginning to know. What she did next, I did not see coming, not there, not that night. She remained standing after the applause died. She thanked the room. She talked about the team, about the work, about what this new chapter meant to her. And then she said, "I also want to take this moment to say publicly that I am entering this chapter as an independent woman. My attorneys have already filed." She didn't look at me when she said it. The room was very quiet for a moment. I was aware of people looking at me, of Meredith across the table, going still, of Todd setting down his glass. I looked at Sylvia. She finally met my eyes, and there was something in her expression I hadn't expected, not coldness, not triumph, but something closer to relief, like she'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I smiled, not a bitter smile, not a performance, something quieter than that. I picked up my water glass and I nodded once, the way I used to nod on job sites when the drawings finally matched the ground, when the thing I'd been calculating in my head finally resolved into something I could see clearly. Then I set the glass down and waited for the evening to end. What Sylvia didn't know when she made that announcement was what Carson and I had spent 3 months doing. She'd assumed, I think, that our finances were what they appeared to be. The house, my retirement accounts, the joint savings, my pension. Assets that would be divided. A settlement that would be hers to negotiate from a position of new strength. What she hadn't accounted for was the Brennan Family Trust. I'd established it 22 months earlier, well before her appointment, before the acquisition, before any of this began to move quickly. I'd set it up at the advice of an estate attorney after my mother died, ostensibly for inheritance planning purposes, which was true, but it also held certain things. The house was not in our joint names anymore. It had been transferred into the trust 14 months ago, legally, cleanly, with proper documentation, at a time when there was no divorce proceeding, no legal conflict of interest, no grounds to challenge. My pension, 37 years of contributions to an ERISA-qualified plan, was protected by federal statute, not a marital asset subject to division in the way she'd anticipated. The joint savings account had been drawn down over 8 months, not hidden, not fraudulently, but used, for trust expenses, for legal fees, for legitimate transfers documented to the penny. Carson had been meticulous. What remained for negotiation was a fair portion. I was not trying to leave Sylvia with nothing, that was never the point, and it's not who I am. But the picture she presented to her attorneys, the picture that assumed I'd been sitting at the kitchen table waiting without noticing anything, that picture was incomplete. When her attorneys and Carson sat down the following week, the conversation did not go the way she'd expected. Meredith called me 2 days after the dinner. She was crying, a little, when she first picked up. She said she didn't know her mother had planned to do that. She said she was sorry. I told her not to apologize. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I told her that her mother and I were two people who had loved each other for a long time and had arrived at a place where that wasn't enough to keep us in the same direction. And that was a thing that happened to people who lived long enough. It wasn't the moral failing. It wasn't entirely anyone's fault. She said, "How are you so calm?" I told her that I'd had some time to get there. She said, "Dad, did you know she was going to do that?" I was quiet for a moment. I said I knew something was coming. I didn't know the shape of it. She was quiet on her end. Then she said, "The trust." Todd told me about the trust. I didn't say anything to that. She said quietly, "You've been thinking about this for a long time." I said, "I've been hoping I was wrong for a long time. Those aren't the same thing. I'm not going to tell you I handled everything well. There were nights, a lot of them, scattered across those 18 months, where I sat in the garage past midnight working on nothing in particular because the alternative was lying in bed staring at the ceiling. There were mornings when I made coffee for 2 out of habit before I remembered. There were moments when I looked at Sylvia across the dinner table and felt something that wasn't anger or bitterness but just a deep, tired grief for the version of us that apparently existed more completely in my memory than in hers. I'm not interested in painting her as a villain. She's a complicated person who wanted something she'd been told at some point in her life that women like her weren't supposed to want. Some of her behavior was unkind. Some of it was calculated in ways I didn't deserve. But I'm 64 years old, and I've been wrong about enough things to know that a story with one villain is usually a story that isn't being told completely. What I will say is that the silence I kept in those months of preparation was not a weapon, it was a boundary. It was the only thing I had that was entirely mine. The knowledge of what I'd done, the certainty of where I stood, the quiet of knowing that whatever happened next, I had not been careless with 41 years. The divorce proceedings have been straightforward so far. Sylvia's attorneys pushed in 2 places where they expected to find room and found none. There was a brief period of back and forth that I'm told was tense, though I wasn't present for it. Carson handled it. He told me it went as expected. We're in mediation now. It'll likely finalize before the end of the year. I still live in the house and the trust, but still the house I've lived in for 31 years. The one with the kitchen where I've made 10,000 cups of coffee, and the garage where I've built furniture I gave to people I love. I'm not certain what I'll do with it long term. Maybe sell it eventually. Maybe not. Meredith comes out with the grandkids about once a month. Her son is 7 and wants to know everything about how buildings stay up, which I find enormously satisfying. We spend hours in the garage with blocks and books and questions I am very glad to answer. Todd is adjusting to a complicated new configuration in his company. He's handling it with more grace than most men would. I respect him for that. Sylvia is in Denver now. She has an apartment near the office. By all accounts, she's doing well at the job. I hope she is. I'm not being polite when I say that. I genuinely hope she builds the life she was trying to build. I just couldn't be the furniture in it anymore. Someone asked me recently, a friend, one of the few I've told most of this to, why I smiled that night at the dinner. When she made the announcement and the room went quiet and everyone was looking at me. He expected me to say it was about the trust, about knowing I had the ground covered under me. But that wasn't it exactly. I smiled because I recognized the moment. I'd spent 37 years in structural engineering, and the thing you learn, if you learn anything, is to respect the load. You don't fight the forces acting on a structure. You design for them. You account for them before they arrive. I'd spent 18 months accounting for forces I could feel but couldn't see yet. And in that moment, in that quiet room, with Sylvia finally saying out loud what she'd already decided, the structure resolved. Everything I'd calculated came to rest exactly where I'd expected it. Not a collapse, a settlement, in the engineering sense. The building holds, not the same building, not the one I thought I was living in, but something honest, something load-bearing, something I can stand on without checking my footing every time I move. That's what the smile was. That's what it meant. I'm 64 years old. I've built things meant to hold weight for a living. And I'm still here, standing on my own foundation in a house that belongs to no one but the name I gave it. That's enough. For now, that's more than enough. I've thought a lot about that dinner, the way the room went quiet, the way Sylvia stood there looking composed while I sat with my hands in my lap and my water glass in front of me, and 41 years between us. People ask me if I'm bitter. I tell them no, and I mean it. Not because I'm pretending, but because bitterness would require me to believe I was owed something different, and I'm not sure I was. What happened between Sylvia and me wasn't a crime. It was a drift, a slow uncoupling that neither of us had the courage to name until she did, in a private dining room in Denver, in front of people who didn't know us well enough to look away. What I've come to believe is that how a person behaves when no one is watching is the only real measure of who they are. Not the titles, not the results on a quarterly report, not the applause in a room full of colleagues. I spend months doing things quietly, working with Carson, documenting, preparing, and I did those things not to win anything, but because I believed I owed it to myself to be careful, to be honest about what I was seeing, to not pretend that love alone was a load-bearing structure when the foundation had already shifted. That's the thing about integrity. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just means you do the right thing in the right order, especially when doing nothing would be easier. I could have ignored what Todd told me. I could have convinced myself I was being paranoid. A lot of men my age would have. But I'd spent a career building things designed to hold weight, and I knew what it meant to check your calculations before something collapsed, not after. And Meredith. She called me, and she was crying, and she asked how I was so calm. I told her I'd had time to get there, but the fuller truth is that I'd been preparing not just financially. I'd been preparing emotionally, too, grieving something slowly so it didn't destroy me all at once. That's not coldness, that's endurance. That's the difference between a man who breaks under pressure and a man who bends, absorbs, and finds his footing again. I learned that somewhere between my first structural job and my last, and I'm glad I learned it before I needed it in my own kitchen. What Sylvia did took a kind of courage, even if the execution was unkind. She wanted something. She went and got it. I don't fault her for wanting. I fault her, mildly and without heat, for the way she chose to tell me, publicly, ceremonially, like it was the final line of a speech she'd been rehearsing. That wasn't honest. That was theatrical. And the difference between honesty and theater is something I hope she eventually reckons with on her own terms. What I know is this: I'm 64 years old, and the house is quiet now, but it's an honest quiet. My grandson sits in the garage and asks me how bridges stay up. I tell him the truth, that they stay up because someone did the math before anyone ever walked across them. Someone thought about all the ways it could fail and designed for that, carefully, without shortcuts. That's all any of us can do. Think carefully, act honestly, hold your ground when the weight comes. The rest resolves on its own.